Test. All right. Welcome to today's live stream, everyone. If you're new to our channel, it looks like we do have some people joining from YouTube as well as our community. I'm Jonathan Benyon with the Institute of Human Anatomy, and today we're going to do an overview of the respiratory system. It's a very interesting and amazing system. I'm going to go over some lecture slides to show you some cool basic anatomy about the respiratory system, and then, of course, we'll take a look at the cadaver dissections to kind of drive the points home here. So, as you've probably seen in the chat, we will take some time to answer questions at the end. We do have our live community that posts questions, and with our live community, we'll answer their questions first. And then if there's any extra questions from just our YouTube followers or anybody in the YouTube chat, we'll also try to do our best to answer as many of those questions as we can at the end. So let's just jump right into the respiratory system. So whenever we introduce the respiratory system, we kind of start from the top up, the upper respiratory passageways, and then move down into the lower respiratory passageways. And so that's what this picture and our little list is showing us here. Basically, how we're going to bring air into our bodies, take it down through the respiratory passageways. And the key is to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide with the bloodstream. One of the cool things about any of the systems that you learn in anatomy, almost all the systems, well, pretty much every one of the systems, is at one point going to have this interface with the cardiovascular system with some exchange, whether it's the respiratory system exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide, whether it's the digestive system getting nutrients brought into the bloodstream from the digestive tract, or like the urinary system where we're exchanging or getting rid of waste products. There's going to be this point where we have to meet up with the cardiovascular system, or in other words, the bloodstream here. So let's start with these upper respiratory passageways here. And first, if we breathe in through the nose, we can bring things into the nasal cavity, which I'll just write an NS right here. So you can see the nasal cavity. Here's the nose here. If we were to move deeper past the nose, your nasal cavity is a lot larger than people might realize, because we often just kind of think of our nostrils and our nose as this way to bring in air through the actual nose or nostrils. But you can see this open space that we have for the nasal cavity. And there's mucous membranes that line in there. We have a question that we'll talk about earlier about what happens when you actually get a stuffy nose. But this is one way to bring in air into our bodies here through this nasal cavity. Now you'll also notice right there, we've got the hard palate, or what you often refer to as the roof of the mouth. And this is primarily made up of the maxillary bone, and the little posterior last portion of it is the palatine bone there. But that hard palate will divide the nasal cavity from our next portion, which is the oral cavity. I'll just put an OC there for oral cavity. You can see the tongue in there, but we can also bring in air through the mouth. We often will say the oral cavity is a common passageway for food and air. Then we move back to the structure called the pharynx. Now, pharynx is a fancy pants name for the throat, and I'm going to outline the pharynx here in red. So about like so-ish. Not a perfect drawing there. But let me change colors so we can label some things here. Now, the pharynx, like I said, is the fancy pants name for the throat, but because anatomists love naming things, we get to divide the pharynx into three portions. And I'll draw some lines about where we would see these portions divide the pharynx. So up here, the upper portion of the pharynx, just posterior to the nasal pharynx, is called, whoops, I just gave you the name. The part of the pharynx that's just posterior to the nasal cavity. I don't know why I have NS here, but you guys, I meant NC for nasal cavity. But here is the nasopharynx. We'll put an NP there for nasopharynx. Then the portion of the pharynx both posterior to the oral cavity is the oropharynx right there. And then the part of the pharynx that's by the larynx, which is also known as the voice box or the Adam's apple, we call that the laryngopharynx. I'll put an LP for that. But that is essentially what we take care of with our upper respiratory passageways, ending with the pharynx here, or the larynx here. And again, I'll circle the larynx about in that yellow there. But the larynx is the voice box, and we're going to talk a little bit about sound production, not a ton. I'll show you some cool things on the actual cadaver dissection in just a little bit. But that takes care of the majority of our upper respiratory passageways, moving into the transition with the larynx where we move down into the lower respiratory passageways. So just a quick overview of the lower respiratory passageways. We will have the trachea, which is essentially from here to here. That's what you often will refer to as the windpipe. That's the first main tube that we're going to see, but we're going to bring air down, and then eventually we're going to branch and distribute into the lungs. And then we get into the bronchial tree, which we see here. And so essentially everything downstream from this yellow line that I've got right here, all of this is the bronchial tree. We'll talk about the principal, lobar, and segmental bronchi, even get into the bronchioles and the alveoli in just a little bit. What we don't have pictured here is the lungs. Essentially, picture millions of little tubes, eventually what we're going to get down to, because we're going to see that the trachea branches multiple times. And think about every time you branch, you essentially double the number of tubes. And we get down into the millions when we talk about the number of alveoli that will get down deeper into the lungs. And essentially all these tubes get wrapped in this elastic connective tissue, which we're going to see creates and forms the lungs, specifically on the cadaver dissections here in just a second. So we're going to take a look at some of the structures of the respiratory passageways here. Now this, you're just going to have to kind of imagine with me here, because we were unable to find a good stock-free or a stock image for the actual mucosal lining of the respiratory tubes. But I want you to just kind of imagine this. Imagine if you had like a tube, like a hose. And if you had a hose that had 3 layers, that's what we're dealing with here. We'd have 3 layers. So picture the trachea that we just showed you. And if we were to cut it in half and look at the layers, we'd see that it actually had 3 main layers here. We got a tunica mucosa, and then we've got this fibromuscular membrane, this middle layer, and then we've got this tunica adventitia here. So if you were to look at the inside lining of the trachea, especially look at it under the microscope, we'd see that it's made out of this epithelial tissue. And I will show you on the cadaver dissection in just a second. But it's made out of this specifically pseudostratified columnar epithelium with cilia. Now, if you've ever taken an anatomy class and got into histology, you probably learned that there was multiple classifications of different type of epithelial tissue. And we don't have to go crazy in what pseudostratified epithelium really means. But the part that I want you to kind of focus on is it's pseudostratified epithelium with cilia. Cilia are these cellular projections or projections of the cell membrane, and cilia are coated in mucus. And so think about if you were to inhale something like dust or particles and you got to the inside lining of that tube there, and if these cilia are projecting into the tube and they're coated with mucus, what happens is the mucus can catch those dust particles that you don't want to go deeper down into the lung tissue. And what's actually really cool about the cilia of the trachea is some people refer to it as a ciliary elevator. And what that means is the cilia tend to beat upwards. And so meaning you catch it in the mucus because the cilia are coated in the mucus, and the cilia kind of beat back up towards your mouth. And what will happen is sometimes you might feel that mucus start to come up a little bit, and sometimes you might clear your throat and actually swallow it, or you might spit it out. Both are options that sometimes people have, certain feelings about. Sometimes people think it's gross to spit out the mucus. Other people think it's gross to swallow it. But I do want to mention, if you swallow it, some people might think, wait a minute, didn't I just take it back down where it came from? And that's not true, because we actually have 2 tubes there. We have the trachea that we had the cilia catching all that dust. And if you swallow it, you actually move it back into the esophagus, a different tube, and take it down to the digestive tract. So you get rid of it out of the trachea in one of 2 ways, pretty much. And I'll show you the esophagus relationship to the trachea in just a second. Now, what we'll see next is the trachea has this tunica fibromuscular cartilaginea. Essentially, it's this middle layer that has these cool cartilaginous rings that I'll show you in just a second, mixed with smooth muscle. And any of you who have asthma or any conditions where you have had a bronchospasm, where the tracheal wall or the deeper tubes like the bronchial spasm, that happens during asthma. It's called a bronchospasm. We'll show you what that comes from, how that works in just a second as well. And then we just have this outer layer that I'll show you, the tunica adventitia, which is this areolar loose connective tissue. Sorry that we didn't have any pictures there, but we'll get a good look at it on the cadaver dissection. But let's break down the bronchial tree into a little bit more detail here. So we have the large bronchi. These are just large tubes. A singular version of this would be called a bronchus. And so remember, we had the trachea coming down right here. And then what we'll have here is our principal or main bronchi, which we'll have essentially here and here. And then we get down to the lobar bronchi. I want you to think about what lobar actually means. Lobar is referring to lobes, and we're going to see that we're going to have lobes in the lungs here. And so we can have lobar bronchi going to individual lobes of the lungs here. Excuse me. And then we're going to get down to the segmental bronchi. And essentially everything downstream, these are like your segmental bronchi coming down here that I'm crossing off in the green here. And then we're going to see we're going to get to even deeper passageways like the bronchioles. So kind of think about, we go from principal, lobar to segmental. I had a friend who used to say, what's the abbreviation for please? And her mnemonic for this was please don't smoke, and PLS, because we don't want to bring smoke down into our bronchial tree. If that works for you as a little mnemonic to help you remember, the P stands for principal, L for lobar, and S for that abbreviation of please. That'll kind of help you to remember the order of the branching of the bronchial tree here. Okay, so now we're going even deeper. We have bronchioles, alveolar ducts, alveolar sacs, and alveoli. This is where it gets really fascinating. I think this is an incredible thing that happens as far as how much surface area we create. Now, what we're going to find is that we're going to eventually get to millions of these alveoli in just a second, because we want to exchange as much oxygen and carbon dioxide as we possibly can here. So let's go back to labeling some of the stuff here. So first we have a bronchiole. Just think of a bronchiole as a smaller bronchus. Then we're going to have an even further branching occur, and we're going to get to alveolar ducts here. And so an alveolar duct would be this. These are just essentially branching off of the bronchioles. And then we get to alveolar sacs, which here is one whole alveolar sac. Think of an alveolar sac as kind of like a bundle of grapes. That's kind of what it reminds me of, a big bundle of grapes. And then we have the whole alveolar sac made up of multiple alveoli. Alveolus would be singular, but the alveoli are essentially the individual grapes that you're kind of seeing there. Now, one thing you want to notice about this picture is that the alveoli are engulfed in blood vessels, tiny little blood vessels that we're going to refer to as pulmonary capillaries. And capillaries, they're a type of blood vessel that exchange nutrients with tissues. And in the case of the alveoli, they're going to exchange carbon dioxide and oxygen with the alveoli. So let's go take a look at this. I'm going to bring this up in just a second here. So let me actually talk about it now. So the tunica mucosa and the tunica fibromusculocartilaginea, remember how I brought those up? Let me show you this picture here. So if you look closely at this picture, you can see that the trachea has these rings in blue there. And what you're not seeing in between the rings there'd be smooth muscle mixed in between the rings, kind of that yellowish or beige color there. And the reason I'm bringing this up here is because what I'm going to mention and show you on the real for asthma attacks, it's a spasm during an asthma attack, which we don't want to happen, but we do have the ability to change the diameter of the tube based on the activities that we're participating in. The reason I'm bringing this up is if you look closely, especially down here, you can start to see the cartilage starting to break up a little bit here. And the reason for that is when we get down to here, we don't want any obstruction for the lung tissue. We don't have as much cartilage and smooth muscle in there, because what we're trying to do is allow for those alveoli to completely expand. Now, let me show you the next part here. So this is a zoomed in version of one alveoli here, and then one piece of a pulmonary capillary here. So here's what's happening here. Let me label these for you. So we have a pulmonary arteriole that's taking blood to the capillary. And this is, for those of you who've taken an anatomy class before, this is one of those exceptions where an arteriole actually contains deoxygenated blood rather than oxygenated blood. And so what we're trying to do is get the carbon dioxide out, which you can see from these arrows, out of the bloodstream. And we would breathe that out, which is going with that blue arrow right there. And then what's happening at the same time is we're breathing in, well, after we exhale, we inhale and bring that oxygen in. And that's what we're seeing with this pulmonary capillary. This whole portion right here is the pulmonary capillary. And you can see what's happening is the carbon dioxide is moving out, but then the oxygen that we're breathing in is now moving into the blood, and that goes into this pulmonary venule and goes back to the left side of the heart. Now that's what's really crazy about this is how quickly this happens when we actually inhale and exhale and how fast we can exchange carbon dioxide and oxygen with the blood. But this is crazy to think about. This is just showing you one alveoli. We got millions of these structures throughout both of the lungs. And so this just gives us this elegant system where we take this respiratory system, interface it with the cardiovascular system to allow us to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. And obviously this occurs at different rates depending on our respiratory rate. Like if we're exercising, we're obviously going to increase our respiratory rate, and we'd be exchanging more carbon dioxide and oxygen during those situations there. So that's kind of this brief overview of the respiratory system. Kind of the main point is, again, to exchange this carbon dioxide and oxygen. But let me show you some of the cadaver dissections here, because that'll be a lot of fun for everybody to take a look at here. So let me just glove up here. And then we'll move on to some cadaver dissections. Let's see, where did we put the probe? All right, I'm going to use the sagittal head first. All right, everybody, we have a couple of cadaver dissections I want to show you here. But this is pretty much the same view that we had at the very beginning of the lecture discussion here. We had the nasal cavity. Now, technically on this particular cadaver dissection, which was different from the picture, on the picture we didn't have the nasal septum there. And the nasal septum just divides the nasal cavity into right and left side. So the right half of that nasal cavity has been removed, but the left half I can stick underneath there, and my probe is essentially in that left nasal cavity there, that septum's dividing both cavities. And so, or both sides of the cavities there. And here we have that hard palate. You can see as I tap it there, you might be able to hear. That's mostly bony. And then we have our soft palate here. Or specifically, we have the uvula, which is part of the soft palate. I used to call it the hangy doodle when I was a little kid, but that's just my random name when I was a little kid. Down below, we have the oral cavity here. Again, both of these options, the oral cavity or the nasal cavity, can be used to bring in air. And then we've got the pharynx here. And here would be the nasopharynx, the oral pharynx, and this region would be the laryngopharynx. And you can actually see the larynx right here. You can see the epiglottis. This is a little flappy doodad. I didn't really call it that when I was a little kid because I didn't know that it even existed. But it's this elastic cartilage that's supposed to close off the airway when we swallow. So food goes down the food tube posteriorly, and no food or water goes anteriorly into that trachea here. And you can start to see some of the vocal folds here, or vocal ligaments, what most people will refer to as the vocal cords here. But then we've got the trachea moving down like so. Now let me shift over to another cadaver dissection here. So we're going to move down into the lower airways here. All right, so here, this is just trachea and larynx that's been removed from the body here. So here is the larynx right here, and this point right there is the same of where I'd point right on me. So that would be the actual larynx, and specifically this is called the thyroid cartilage. Thyroid actually means shield, but you can actually even see the thyroid gland below, I'm sorry. The thyroid gland, completely different system, part of the endocrine system, which we'll do in another one of our live sessions, but you can see that relationship to the thyroid cartilage. Now, here's what's so cool about the trachea. you can see these cartilaginous rings if you look closely right there. And in between, we have that membranous tissue, and there'd be some smooth muscle mixed in between those cartilaginous rings. And they're not true rings. They're actually more like kind of a horseshoe shaped. And I always found this fascinating when I looked at the trachea for the first time. If I show you the posterior side, you can see how those cartilaginous rings, like I said, they're more like horseshoe shaped rings, not full rings. And you've got this fibromuscular membrane on the back side there. That's a dead giveaway that this would be a posterior view, because the anterior view, you can see those rings coming around right there. And then we start to see the first part of the branchings. We get the right principal or main bronchi, and then the left principal main bronchi there. And one thing I did mention to you is that we do have two tubes. Now, I didn't mean to gross everybody out from that analogy, but remember, if we have mucus come up from the trachea, we can decide to hack it out, cough it out, or spit it out. Or you can decide to get it to this point and swallow it posteriorly down into the esophagus right here, which is the actual food tube there. And that would just take whatever you swallowed down to the stomach there. A couple other things I do want to mention about this is, remember I said the inside lining here, if I can bring that up here a little bit closer to you. The inside lining of the trachea was made of that pseudostratified columnar epithelium with cilia. And again, that was important to catch anything in the mucus, and the cilia could move it upwards. And again, I already mentioned about if we swallow or spit it out there. I'll stop talking about that. But let me move on to when we branch down a little bit lower. Here's another dissection that we have here. This one was actually from a sagittal cut. So this is a sagittal cut. A sagittal section or a sagittal cut divides the body into right and left halves. We'll get into other sections when we talk about anatomy basics, but there's like frontal sections and horizontal sections. But this is a cut that went like so. And you can actually see this would be the inside lining of that trachea. And if we looked at it under the microscope, we again would see that pseudostratified columnar epithelium with cilia lining this airway here. Now, what's really cool is you can start to see how we go into the main bronchus, and we start to get to lobar bronchi, and even start to branch into segmental bronchi, which you can see going into the actual lung tissue there, which is super cool. Now, one of my favorite things about this particular cadaver dissection is that if you've taken an anatomy class before, you've likely heard that the left lung has 2 lobes and the right lung has 3 lobes. And so if you just take a look at this lung right here, this pretty clearly, I can see 1 lobe here and 1 lobe there. And essentially this is a left lung. Now, some other cool things or features you can see about it. This flat surface, this diaphragmatic surface, that's where it would actually sit on the diaphragm. Let me just get a little centered so you can see a little better. You can also have and see the cardiac impression. That's where the heart would actually sit. You can even see the impression of the aorta right there if you look closely, just running down on those ridges there. And this would be where the aorta ran on the left side of the body before it got more centralized closer to the abdomen there. Now, the reason why I think this is a really cool dissection comparing these two is that if you looked at this lung, you would say, okay, I've got 2 lobes, so it has to be a left lung. But it actually is not a left lung. It is actually a right lung. And when I pulled this out from the body here, I remember bringing it over to the tray, and I'm like, okay, I've got the 1, 2, and I'm like looking for a 3rd lobe because I was almost positive that I pulled it out of the right side of the cadaver that we were working on that day. And I remember walking back and forth to the cadaver like 2 or 3 times just to confirm that my mind wasn't playing tricks on me. And yes, I did pull it from the right side. Now, this person that we got this lung from did not have a lobectomy or any major lung issues that would require any removal of lobes while this body was alive or this person was alive. And so what can happen is you can get some variation here. And what I'll often tell students is that essentially what happens first when you're developing inside mom is that the tubing actually kind of gets set up first. So we get the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, and the alveoli. They all get set up first. And then they start to get wrapped in the connective tissue that eventually forms the lungs that you're seeing here, surrounding and wrapping all those tubes and alveoli. And what can happen sometimes is that the lungs just get packaged a little bit differently sometimes in some people. Yes, still the majority of people will have 3 lobes on the right and 2 lobes on the left. It's just sometimes people might get their right side packaged into 2 lobes rather than 3. There's actually been cadaver labs that have found like 3 lobes on the left side. Again, These are not the norms, but every once in a while you can see a variation when you're in an anatomy lab, and it's kind of a little bit of a surprise there. So hopefully that gave you a cool little overview of oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange in the human body, and gave you a cool little, abnormality, or, little thing that you can see that sometimes we have some variation in one person versus another person. But let's go to some questions here. And the first one I remember actually came from our community, and that was what happens when you get a stuffy nose. And so I just want to address that, because all of us have had a stuffy nose at one point in our lives. And pretty much getting a stuffy nose is a two-part problem. One, those mucous membranes inside of your nasal cavity and your nasal passageways, and even in your sinuses, will get inflamed. And when things get inflamed, they tend to get more puffy, if that makes sense. They swell. And so literally think of the mucous membranes, when you're healthy and you're not sick or you don't have a cold, those mucous membranes are a little thinner. But as the inflammatory response occurs, they'll start to swell up and take up more space. So you can see just from them swelling up, we'll start to narrow those nasal passageways and make you have a feeling of stuffiness. But on top of that, they also tend to secrete even more mucus. And so you've got these more puffier, swollen mucous membranes, plus they're secreting more mucus. Both of those things contribute to that feeling of having a stuffy nose, where you're like having a hard time breathing through your nose because of that virus or whatever you're dealing with. Typically it's a virus, but sometimes it can be from allergies as well. But let me go to some of the other questions that we have here as well. So I'm just going to read through some of these on my computer here and see if I can answer some of these. So I don't know if I'm pronouncing this name correctly, but Chalice. Why have they been divided in different names and parts despite seeming like one singular long downward tunnel? I actually really love that question, because we've talked about it before, and I'll kind of give you an analogy that a physiology professor said once up at the university I was going to school at. This physiology professor was biased to physiology. He didn't like anatomy as much as he liked physiology, but I remember him saying one day, he's like, I don't understand why they take this one tube, this artery that comes off of the aorta, and it's one continuous tube that goes down to the arm, and they keep changing the name from region to region to region. And we all kind of were listening and thinking about that. But if you actually look at it from a logical standpoint, and say for like a medical standpoint, if we just called this whole thing that's eventually going into the arm the brachial artery, and say somebody had a problem in that artery, or like a clot, or some issue that we had to distinguish, and they just said, oh, there's a problem in the brachial artery. You're like, okay, where along that pathway is it? And that's one way that his analogy didn't make sense, and why we need specific names. Instead of calling this whole thing the brachial artery, we can call it the subclavian artery, which is a very specific segment. We can call it the axillary artery here, which is a very specific segment. Then we actually get to the brachial artery. Then we have the radial and the ulnar artery. And those things are really helpful from a medical standpoint to pinpoint where there's specific problems. But even just from a more logical standpoint from anatomy, this is for blood vessels. Every time an artery branches, giving it a new name makes a lot of sense, because it's a different pathway now. It might be going to a different region of the body. Now, with the respiratory tract, you can kind of think of that as the same way. It is kind of in one way, especially down to before the trachea branches, one kind of continuous tube. But these structures have different morphology, different shapes, and even some different functions. And so we want to distinguish each individual part as we go through the respiratory tract, and move down through the trackway here, and then go through each individual part right there. Sorry, everybody. Let me just go right here. Let's see here. We had a little interruption there. I apologize for that. But hopefully that answered your question. But we do need to distinguish specific parts in the respiratory tract, not only from a medical standpoint, but also like a structural and a functional standpoint. Probably could have just said that and answered the question, but you know me, I like to get on my little tangents here. So Cynthia Keatle asked, why are Adam's apples larger in men? And that Adam's apple is the larynx. And so the Adam's apple, what happens during puberty is, with males, testosterone makes a huge jump And with estrogen, we get a huge spike with females. And testosterone tends to enlarge the larynx. And this also accounts for a deeper voice. When you look at males' respiratory tract versus females' respiratory tracts, they just are larger in general. It makes sense from a larger body, tends to need more oxygen to literally deal with larger muscles, more tissues, I guess more volume, more amount of the same tissues. But one of the things that you want to think about with the Adam's apple too is, again, a larger Adam's apple also accounts for the deeper voice there. Okay, I'm going to go to the next one. So somebody asked if I could show the frontal sinuses. I'll have to glove up there. I'll show you one piece of a frontal sinus here. This was from, I lost it already, Tommy. So I just have one small piece of a frontal sinus. So here's a little small piece of the right frontal sinus. And the reason why it's a small piece there is your frontal sinuses are essentially right there. And this sagittal cut was slightly off center to the right. And so we got a little piece of the right frontal sinus. The left frontal sinus would be further over on the other side. And your sinuses are really cool. They're these hollow cavities that actually, one, reduce the weight of the skull. And so if you actually see another, take a look at another sinus, you can see the sphenoidal sinus right there. And the sphenoidal sinus, that's one right in the center of the skull, but you also have like the maxillary sinuses in your cheeks. And sinuses are not for just getting infections. Like I said, one of their functions is to reduce the weight of the skull. They also are aligned with mucous membranes, and so they'll actually warm and moisten the air before it goes down into the lower respiratory passageways. And my favorite function of the sinuses is they also act as resonance chambers. And so think about that. They influence how you sound. So if you come up here from the actual, I need to move the cadaver dissection here. So if you come up from here and look at the larynx, the voice box, we're producing sound from the air coming up and vibrating those vocal cords here. But also, when that sound comes up, it'll resonate throughout those hollow chambers of the skull and influence how you sound. I'm a little bit of a nerd, and so I often will tell my students, you can get better at singing by practicing and learning to coordinate your tongue muscles, your laryngeal muscles that control the tension on your vocal cords, getting your diaphragm involved. You can practice and become a better singer. But at some point, you just kind of have to admit that some people just have nicer skulls than others, I guess, meaning how their resonance chambers will resonate that sound. And we all know that this can change when we get those mucous membranes inflamed. They're producing more mucus. Like when we have a cold, our voice tends to sound differently because that resonance changes based on the mucus and the swelling. So it's kind of cool to think about the multiple functions of those sinus cavities here. Let me go to a couple other questions here. So Chalise also asked, why do you think it's a horseshoe shape and not a full circle? That's a great question as well. She's talking about the those cartilaginous horseshoe-shaped rings. We want to have some ability to change the diameter. If we had a full ring, that would lessen the amount of play, I guess we could say, or the bronchodilation or bronchoconstriction that we could actually have some control over. And when I say control, it's involuntary control because your autonomic nervous system takes care of that. But if you are exercising, you may want your airways to be a little bit more open so that smooth muscle might relax a little bit more so we can bring more air in and out of the system there. But the reason why they're not full rings is, again, because we do want some play and some ability to change the diameter with that smooth muscle there. All right, let's look at some other questions. Let's see. Yeah, so Wayne asked, can I show where the base and the apex and the hilum of the lung is? I'm going to have to keep gloving up here. You guys are really excited about the cadaver dissections here. I'm just going to not do that. I used to teach barehanded, everybody. So this is you getting a glimpse of that. I'm going to just teach barehanded. I used to teach barehanded for students when they'd first come to the cadaver lab for the first time, so they'd know they weren't going to die if anything touched, if the fluid or anything got on their hands. So I'm just going to do it this way. So here, you actually have the apex of the lungs there. The apices are the apex of each lung. when you do a full inhale, can actually get close to the range of the clavicle, and even a little bit of a piece of that apex right there could even make it above the clavicle with a full inhalation. So that's the top of the lung is what you could think of it. I did show the bottom portion here, which is the base of the lung here where it sits on the diaphragm. Now, hilum is something that not everybody's heard of before, but hilum is this entryway where all the blood vessels and the bronchial tree is entering into the lungs there. So it's kind of this entryway where air is going in and out, as well as the blood vessels are going in and out. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of visual there. All right. All right, is it, let's see. Is there a difference in efficiency when breathing through the mouth versus the nose? I think that's Martin that asked that question. And in a way, yes. Like as we improve as we start to increase intensity of exercise, for example, when you're just at rest, nasal breathing's great. If you can nasal breathe, we'd prefer to do a lot of nasal breathing because, again, we have that extra ability to pass that air through those mucous membranes and warm and moisten the air when we pass it through the nasal cavity. But so, for example, if you watch some of our YouTube videos, you know I've talked about like the different zones of intensity, like zone 1 or zone 2. Zone 2 training, you've often heard me talk about. That would be a cardiovascular intensity where you're jogging or cycling. And if you're in zone 2, you could still mostly have a conversation with a friend without having to like take big breaths in the middle of a sentence. You'd probably be breathing in between sentences, but that'd be like a zone 2 intensity. That's often also referred to as an intensity where you could do a lot of nasal breathing. You could breathe in through your nose through a lot of that zone 2 exercise session. But if you were to push the intensity, start running faster, start cycling more, and you start going into zone 3 or zone 4, there's no way you could supply your body with the oxygen it needs to maintain that zone if you were to just continue to nasal breathe. If you were nasal breathing, then you'd probably last a while. You might be able to nasal breathe at the beginning, but you wouldn't be able to last as long in like a higher intensity zone of exercise if you just were trying to breathe through your nose. So eventually you're just gonna have to switch to mouth breathing. That always reminds me of Stranger Things. If anybody likes Stranger Things, the mouth breathers was the insult that they would give people. But mouth breathing is not a bad thing when you're at a higher intensity, especially, like I said, depending if you're using that 5-zone system. When you're hitting zone 4 and zone 5 and you're running really hard, you're going to have to breathe in through your mouth. So you're just going to be able to bring in that much more oxygen down into your lungs, as well as expel more carbon dioxide if you start shifting to mouth breathing during the higher intensities there. All right. Okay, so someone asked, can you also show the hypopharynx? Someone asked, where does the food go if you inhale it? The hypopharynx is what I actually mentioned before. It's another name for the laryngopharynx. And so that's part of the pharynx that is just by the larynx, which is, whoops, I got to shift it over to the right camera. Sorry, everybody, which is just right here in this region. So if you were to inhale food or water, sometimes we've all had that issue there, that food or water would try to go this direction. And usually it doesn't take much. Just some small water droplets in there will cause the cough reflex to happen. And potentially, if you were to aspirate something, it would move down the respiratory passageways. And obviously, your body would react to that with a lot of coughing. But where we want the food and water to go when we swallow, that epiglottis should close off the larynx and the food and water should go down that way. All right, I think we have a couple of times, or a little bit of time for one or two more questions. Somebody said, what does it mean when you have a lung module? I'm guessing that's a typo and meant lung nodule. That can vary a lot. A lung nodule can be a cancerous nodule. That would be one of the things they would want to investigate if they noticed some nodular structure or a nodule within the lungs. They would want to know if it's a benign growth, just something that's not going to spread and become cancerous, versus say like maybe a cancerous tumor growing in there. So that's a pretty generalized question, but I'm guessing that's what they meant rather than module, probably nodule there. But again, a nodule could be just an abnormal growth. Abnormal growth could be benign, not cancerous, and maybe not even a problem. They could just leave it in there. But again, they may want to biopsy something like that to see if it is cancerous, and it could potentially grow and become a larger problem. There's different types of lung cancer, which we don't have time to get into in this live stream, but hopefully that gives you kind of an idea from that question there. We have time for one or two more questions. Okay, so somebody asked, so how do the lungs clean themselves? Are the dust particles mostly just stuck there, or is there a mechanism to drain them out? That's a really cool and interesting question there. We do have the mechanism of catching it in the mucus and coughing it out, but if it does make it down further, we do have what's called hilar lymph nodes. I don't think I have a great example of them in here because I think they got removed. Oh, nope, I've got one little lymph node here. Thanks. I had somebody remind me here. Right here is an actual, I'm going to pinch it right there. I don't know if you can see that. That's actually, this little structure right there is a hilar lymph node. And so what happens, and often if you like cut into the hilar lymph nodes, you can kind of, they almost look dirty from dust particles or things like that. So you do have a filtration system for the lungs if things get deeper into. There's obviously limitations to that. Certain workers in certain industries obviously can inhale harmful particles that could lead to potential lung damage or lung conditions. But you do have some defense mechanisms if things make it down into the lung tissues. You also have white blood cells, obviously, and your immune system, which would try to fight off pathogens. But if you have particles that are not in the category of, say, like viruses, bacteria, or a fungus, then you do have these hilar lymph nodes that kind of act as filters for things that make it down deeper into the lung tissue there. All right. The next question is, Tanya asks, where sputum is produced exactly? Sputum could technically be produced almost anywhere along the respiratory tract where there's mucous membranes. You're not going to produce as much sputum, say, like down in the alveoli and the deeper respiratory passageways, because what I didn't actually tell you, which is actually pretty fascinating, is, and I think I hesitated on mentioning this because we didn't have like an actual microscopic picture, but if you remember, I said the trachea was made of this pseudostratified columnar epithelium with cilia. And that pseudostratified columnar epithelium with the cilia, any mucous membrane that has essentially that type of epithelium can produce the mucus, or what we might think of as sputum. And obviously we can produce it in our nasal cavity as well. But as you move deeper down into the respiratory tract, that pseudostratified columnar epithelium with cilia starts to transition into what's called simple squamous epithelium. And the simple squamous epithelium is essentially what the alveoli are made out of. And the simple squamous means, simple means one cell layer thick, and squamous means flat cells. So those grape-like alveoli are made of simple squamous epithelium, and they're not going to be producing a ton of mucus like if we move back higher up into the respiratory tract. But a lot of times people who have had bronchitis, pneumonia, even in those lower respiratory tracts and the bronchi, they can definitely produce mucus, and sometimes you have that feeling of needing to cough or hack that stuff up too. So hopefully that kind of gives you an idea of where you can produce mucus along the respiratory tract way. You just tend to not produce it when you transition as much to that simple squamous epithelium there. So hopefully that answers a lot of your guys' questions. Sorry we couldn't answer every single one of them. And I apologize if there's any glitches in the system there. Every once in a while we get some glitches with our internet here, and we're still trying to work that kink out. And we did have some random interruptions today with people walking in. So hopefully you learned some cool stuff, everybody. Thanks for supporting our channel. Thanks to our community members. If you're interested in joining our community, we want to put that link in, guys? Or we'll probably link it at the in the chat here for everybody if they want to take a look at that. And we'll see you in the next live.